Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Dahrendorf program, let me welcome everyone to today's lecture. My name is Dimitar Bechev, and I have the pleasure to be the director of the Dahrendorf program at the European Studies Centre, St. Anthony's College, Oxford. And before we move to our distinguished speaker, let me pay tribute to the patron of the Dahrendorf program, Lord Ralph Dahrendorf, the late warden of St. Anthony's College, but also eminent theorist of liberalism and think on Europe and global affairs. One of his many pertinent thoughts had to do with the nature of politics. So Dahrendorf famously said that the task of politics is not to create a perfect world, but to build and sustain a framework within which imperfect people can live together in freedom. So right now, we can all agree that we do have an imperfect world. The question is whether we have the framework that will enable us to live and coexist together. And potentially it's also not just an imperfect, but more importantly, illiberal world. And this is liberalism with small l. And I think there's no one else better suited to address some of those issues than our speaker today, Robert Kagan. Many of you who go back in time surely remember his seminal essay about paradise and power, and book later on, around the time of what we saw after Iraq as the rift between Europe and America. But right now we are nostalgic for the good old days of George W. Bush. And some of us have come to the stage of being nostalgic also for the first Trump administration. So things have moved on. Bob needs no introduction, therefore. He has written extensively on public affairs. But let me plug in his latest book, which came out last year. It's called Rebellion: How Anti-Liberalism is Tearing America Apart Again. So this is not a novel phenomenon, just to give you some of the flavor of his talk. And this rebellion is not only about domestic politics in the United States, it's also about the world at large, and it's about Europe. And by Europe, the Dahrendorf program also means the United Kingdom. Some of the revolutionaries around Trump see the battle waged also in European politics. We are waking up today to the news of reforms scoring gains in key constituencies and places around Britain, so it's hot off the news. But our brief is first and foremost to discuss America. And the question for me is, what is the relationship between us Europeans and the Americans? Can we speak still of a community? Is America the other? Is Europe coming of age in response to this American turnaround, the revolution that is going on, the rebellion, if you will? But without further ado, let me pass the floor now to Robert Kagan. And I'm very much looking forward. I hope there will be a glimmer of hope towards the end, but I'm not betting on it.
Forget that. Goodbye. Thank you.
But there we go. We don't do hope in this world of ours. But over to you, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how honored I am to have been invited to give this lecture. It means a great deal to me. I'm particularly honored as an American. I know you've had other Americans give this lecture, but it's very much a European phenomenon, and so I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact that you allowed this American to give this lecture, since having made some planetary illusions at one time that people may not have been too crazy about in Europe. So I'm really very grateful. I hope you won't take this as any sign of ingratitude if I say I wish you'd given me this opportunity in a previous year. It's not particularly fun to come up here and be the American spokesman at a time when my country is descending into dictatorship and when the world order that the United States created or took part in creating is being destroyed by the United States itself. So I find myself in a pretty difficult. I'm used to coming to Europe and being critiqued, but I'm also used to defending our position, and that's a little bit harder. Now, I also have to just say that I'm giving this talk in the middle of what is, one of the truly remarkable revolutionary periods in geopolitics, and we really can't say how things are going to turn out. So I'm sure anything I say now will look foolish in 3 months. And for some of you may not have to wait that long. This is therefore not what I would have anticipated when Tim was kind enough to invite me. This is something that I would have to describe as a requiem for the American world order. And let me be clear why I call it the American world order and not the liberal world order. I do recognize that it was never a universal order. And I call it the American order because it was heavily shaped by the most powerful nation in the world. And you can refer to a European order in the past, and you can talk about other orders, but it's the American order because of America's power and because the world in many respects reflected American preferences. And I would even go further than that in the sense that there really was an order, and this I would call a liberal order, within the sort of international security structures that the United States created with its fellow democracies. And within that liberal order, there was enormous progress in a liberal direction, a progress not only in terms of how the nations within that order dealt with each other, which really was largely through laws and institutions. I'm talking about within the international security structure with the United States at the heart of it, but also what was happening domestically and inside borders, and the increasing effort to achieve some of the vision of liberalism. And so in that sense, I think it very much was an order. So partly this is a historical tribute, I suppose, but partly it's also necessary, I think, to think about it so we can begin to understand what is now going to be lost and what is no longer going to be an organizing principle and what are the consequences of that. I'm not in the practice of quoting Hegel, but I do think his phrase that the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk may be accurate in this situation, in the sense that I think, as Demeter suggested, our appreciation for the American order may grow as it disappears. So the one thing I want to say, to start by saying, is that in many respects, the American position in the world from World War II until just recently defied the laws of physics in terms of international theory. When the United States emerged after World War II as by far the strongest power in the world, and by the way, it was also that after World War I, but it absented itself from the scene so quickly that it didn't have any impact. Or at least it had negative impacts. But after World War II, the United States was a dominant power. It had 50% of global GDP. It had not a monopoly of military power, but certainly a predominant military power. It had bases everywhere, etc. And I think international relations theory would have said, and even today still does say, that in that situation you could expect the rest of the world to band together to try to control this enormously powerful nation. Because it ought to be frightening for one nation to wield this much power in the international system. But of course, what we saw over the course of those decades was a remarkable acceptance of American power, and obviously not by everybody, not by Russians and Chinese and others. Although there was a time when Russia briefly flirted with the idea of becoming part of the American security order and the American and the liberal order. But by and large, the great majority of countries did not oppose the rise of American power, and most importantly, did not, as they say in the theoretical business, bandwagon against it. Now, I want to say that this was not because of the striking brilliance of American foreign policy throughout this period. I'm a historian of American foreign policy. I worked in the U.S. government. I worked at the State Department. I know what American policymaking looks like, and no one would confuse it with Bismarckian genius. And it was not because the United States never abused its power, or certainly not because it didn't use military force on many occasions, because of course it did. It was also not because America was never bullying anybody, it never sought economic advantage, etc. It had all those flaws in it. And certainly it was not because the world loved America. Americans are always thinking that there was a time when everybody loved America after Iraq. They used to talk about how, oh, people used to love America, but I tried to assure them no one ever really loved America. But despite all that, American power and leadership was not only accepted by much of the world, and particularly Europe and some of the Asian powers, but it was encouraged in many respects, aided in many respects. When the United States went to war, even in wars that some of the world disapproved of, it never went alone. It always went with dozens of powers supporting it. And it basically was legitimized by much of the world, this degree of American power. And I was always taken by something that the Chinese scholar Yan Shui-tong has written about, which was what he called the institutionalization of American hegemony. But you couldn't institutionalize American hegemony if people didn't fundamentally accept it. And so the question is why? Why was much of the world so accepting of this flawed superpower and the power that it wielded? I think partly it's because of some obvious attitudes that Americans had toward the world, which were very much shaped by geography. The fact that the United States was distant from the other cockpits of conflict in the world, that it had no great power on its borders, with apologies to Canada and Mexico, and therefore Americans did not, after the 19th century when they conquered the continent, did not have territorial ambitions outside the continent. I think people understood that, if anything, Americans were reluctant to get involved in the world. And this, the United States, American foreign policy was always a paradox between the desire to remain aloof from the rest of the world and the desire to influence. And I would argue that what pushed the United States out, in addition to economic interests and others, was in fact liberalism. If you ask me why the United States wound up in 2 world wars, it was ultimately in defense of a liberal order, or in defense of liberal powers against the threat of aggressive autocracies. Walter Lippmann, in World War I, referred to this as the Atlantic community, because obviously at that time people didn't consider Asian countries to be part of that. And I think, when Americans think about why they got into World War I, they think of Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened had the United States not already been out there putting pressure on Japan, trying to control Japan. I think, and the same was true with Germany. It was perfectly clear that the United States was an opponent of Germany. And so it really was American liberalism and the desire to shape a liberal world which led Americans out there. So if you were a liberal power, a liberal people, you could almost count on the United States to some extent to be concerned ultimately with the well-being of liberalism overseas. And that counterbalanced against the fundamentally insular attitude that Americans had, but it left Americans ambivalent. And I think that ambivalence was understood by the rest of the world. I think if Americans had looked I always like to say if Americans had a plan, they would have been much more scary, because if there was actually things that they were pushing for, instead of mostly reacting to the actions of others, they would have been a much scarier power. So I think the world recognized that ambivalence. I think the world recognized the United States was not, in fact, out to dominate the rest of the world. It had a slightly different kind of hegemonic quality. It wanted to make sure that autocratic, aggressive powers did not dominate other parts of the world. I think Americans would have been perfectly happy to leave Europe alone if Europe were just a nice liberal bastion, as it later became. And so I think, as I say, the world understood that, and that's one reason why liberal powers did not feel threatened by the United States. One of the other reasons, I would say, is what I call the Hyman Roth principle. For those of you who have seen The Godfather, and in particular, or read The Godfather, Hyman Roth was a mobster, but what was said about him is Hyman Roth is still alive because he always made money for his partners. And the truth was that being allied to the United States was often, if not a ticket to prosperity, at least not a hindrance to prosperity. And so countries didn't think that they were making a huge economic sacrifice, even though they allowed the United States to be the dominant economic power in the world. And finally, I would say the liberalism of America led to a style of leadership which was more conducive to cooperation than, for instance, the Soviet style of leadership during the Cold War. The fact that John Lewis Gaddis, the American historian, once said that Americans basically dealt with its allies in a relatively democratic fashion because that was the way Americans were used to operating at home, and that was the way they generally tried to operate abroad too. Excuse me. So, for all those factors, the United States was accepted by much of the world as the leading hegemon. And this persisted despite relative decline in American power over the years. The United States was 50% of GDP at the end of World War II. By 1969, it was already down to 25%. And people started predicting then, and certainly in every decade afterwards, that this relative economic decline was going to lead to the decline of the American system. But of course, it did not. People wrote about the rise of the rest. And what they didn't consider about the rise of the rest is that not the growing wealth or power of any other power didn't necessarily detract from the American world order or American power. It depended on which side they were on. So it would be one thing for China or another power that was chafing under American hegemony to gain power, but it was something else for India or Brazil or even Turkey to gain power, because they were not fundamentally interested in challenging the American order, and in some cases they were even additions to the American order. So in some ways, the United States became even more powerful in the international system even as it lost relative economic dominance. And the key thing here is, and I want to be very clear about this, I'm not suggesting that the United States is a wonderful power that everybody should love. But the nations of the world voted with their feet, so to speak. They have had numerous opportunities over the last 80 years, if they thought the United States was a threatening power, to do something about it. They did not have to be allies. They did not have to remain disarmed. They did not have to leave their security in the hands of the United States. And that's the most important thing to consider. A nation is, if it is anything, is designed to protect its people from overseas attack or of any kind, economic or political or military. The fact that much of the world left itself vulnerable to the United States throughout this period was the clearest sign that for all the hegemony the United States exercised and for all the mistakes that it made, nevertheless, people preferred that. And I guess I would say, at the end of the day, that is what this was about. It was compared to what? The question for people was always not what's wrong with what the United States is doing, but what is the actual alternative? And for many decades, of course, people were acutely aware of what the actual alternative was because they'd lived through World War II or they'd lived through the Cold War and they'd seen what the alternatives were. If you look, think about the Cold War for a second. The Cold War, in some respects, is the story of the Soviet Union not being able to hold on to the sphere of interest and control that it won and was granted after World War II. And instead, what happened was those countries sought to become part of the American world order. And so the big shift was the attractiveness of the American order versus the unattractiveness of the Soviet Union as a leader. So, this was so successful, this order was so successful, I would argue, that by the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, everyone had forgotten how that order had been created or what sustained it. And we moved into a phase, not unlike the phase that the world moved into in the first decade of the 20th century, right before World War I, where people actually believed, and I would say because it had gone so long under this successful liberal American-led order, people came to believe that this was simply a natural evolution of humanity, that we had moved from one phase of human existence to another. And that is what the end of history argument was about, which, for all the ridicule it took, nevertheless expressed very well what the general view was, certainly among Europeans and many around the world, that human beings had gotten better, that the Enlightenment had succeeded, that human character had changed, that international relations had changed. And you remember the fads that were very popular in the 1990s. The end of the nation state, you'll recall, was a big factor. The movement away from geopolitics to geoeconomics. All of a sudden, it didn't matter what military power was, whether there was military power. And in many ways, the sort of living symbol of this was the European Union. And Europeans, and now we get back to Mars and Venus and Paradise and Power. What was the argument about at that time? As you recall probably, some of you were old enough to recall, in the 1990s, everyone decided that the United States was the problem. Because if we were moving into this new post-historical era, where power wasn't going to matter anymore in the traditional sense, and where we were moving toward a transnational set of agreements and institutions as the European Union was, then the United States was not only an outlier to that, it was an obstacle to that. And by the way, I want to hasten to say that I wrote that book and I wrote the essay on which it was based before the Iraq War, because this was the prevalent division that existed in the 1990s. Those were the days of the hyperpower, you'll remember. Sam Huntington wrote an article in 1999 called The Lonely Superpower, and he quoted a lot of foreign leaders talking about how hypocritical and annoying and bullying and difficult and hegemonic and evil the United States was. So this was very much a 1990s phenomenon, and I believe it was a consequence of the end of the Cold War and the sense that power of the kind that the United States wielded simply was not only unnecessary, but positively harmful. And we were so optimistic that, many of our friends, John Eikenberry, talked about the transition from the American-dominated liberal order to a liberal order based on international institutions and international agreement. And people talked about multipolarity, especially the French. But it was a particular kind of multipolarity. It was not a conflictual multipolarity. It was just everybody getting together and arriving at reasonably compatible decisions. Now, what happened, unfortunately, is that there was a convergence after the end of the Cold War between this growing attitude in much of the American liberal order, especially in Europe, this attitude that the United States was now an obstacle to the post-historical world that we were moving. There was a synergy between that and American attitudes after the end of the Cold War that they did not need to be involved in the world anymore, that they had accomplished their mission. And this was largely a great failure of memory and historical understanding on the part of the American people, because the foreign policy, the grand strategy, if you will, that the United States adopted, it adopted in World War II, before they had any idea, really, any serious thought of the Soviet Union emerging as an adversary. The order was created to prevent what had happened in the 1930s, which was why it was based on the idea of free trade, why it was based on the idea of stopping aggression, and why it was based on the idea of political liberalism. Those were thought to be the three factors, the opposite of those, which had led to World War II. But nevertheless, Americans forgot that that was what the case was, to the point where even someone like Jeane Kirkpatrick said, I believe in 1990, that it was time for the United States to go back to being a normal nation again. And the impulse to go back to being a normal nation, which the United States had not been to World War II, was very widespread. Iraq accelerated that trend, but it did not begin that trend. Pat Buchanan and his isolationism was very much a 1990s phenomenon. And so, in a certain sense, the United States, after the end of the Cold War, the American public was increasingly skeptical of making the sacrifices of maintaining this international system. And as in the same way that I think Europeans lost sight of the centrality of the American role to everything that they were seeing that was good about the New World, so Americans also lost sight of what the world looks like when the United States wasn't playing that kind of role. But that was the trend that we were on. And, you know, really it follows a pattern of oscillation in American foreign policy. If you asked me what would you could say is the consistent American foreign policy, I would say it is oscillation. If you begin in 1900, certainly when the United States sort of emerged as a power capable of and interested in playing in the world, there were periods of high involvement and intervention culminating in World War I, followed by a long period of desire to retrench and get out, followed by a period of renewed involvement in World War II. It's like a sine wave throughout history, and you can see that even during the Cold War, periods of high involvement followed by periods of post-Vietnam, etc. They were shorter periods. The oscillations were quicker in the Cold War. But nevertheless, oscillation was the norm, and I think the oscillation was due to the dynamic of the extent of the fact that the United States was so powerful that when it was involved, it was able to bring a general peace, which then led Americans to decide that they weren't needed anymore, which then led to the resurgence of international competition, which got to the point where Americans felt they did have to get involved again. And sort of the lesson of World War II lasted as long as it did, and obviously buttressed by the fear of communism, which was such a dominant factor during the Cold War. It may have been excessive fear of communism, but nevertheless, it did keep the United States engaged. But after the end of the Cold War, the oscillation went back in the other direction. And there's another factor in American development which needs to be taken into consideration, which is the fact of the question of ideology. America, as I've written in this book, has always been engaged in a struggle between liberalism and anti-liberalism. The country was founded on liberal principles in the Declaration of Independence, but from the very beginning, a very large portion of Americans did not share those principles. I'm talking about the slave-holding South, and then 100 years of the Reconstruction South, and I could go through any number of ways in which Americans were anti-liberal. There were anti-liberal forces, and what happened in the 1920s was a resurgence of anti-liberalism. Go back to the 1920s and think about what was happening in the United States. This was a period when the Ku Klux Klan enjoyed an enormous revival. There were millions of members. It was practically accepted as a reasonable civic institution in America. This is the period of the greatest crackdown on immigration that the country had ever undertaken. The United States was born with a free immigrant policy. There was no policy about restricting immigration. And then there was the most restrictive immigration law in history in 1924. And that was also accompanied by tariffs and protectionism. And a general it was both anti-liberal and therefore, for the correlation was anti-foreign. And xenophobia was a big part of American policy in the 1920s. And what the interaction between that and its attitude towards Europe is not completely dissimilar from what we're experiencing today. So the world is, unfortunately at the mercy of various American oscillations, and this is where we are today. And I do think it is worth remembering the 1920s because I've been reminded of it lately as Europeans have been very urgently asking the question, will Americans back up a European force in Ukraine? What kind of agreement can you get from the Americans in case that force gets into trouble? And it reminded me exactly of arguments between the transatlantic arguments that were occurring in the 1920s and 30s, which was constantly about what will the Americans do if there's an act of aggression in Europe. And Americans were doing everything they could, especially in the 1920s, to say we are not committing to anything. America in the 1920s, at the beginning, would not receive mail from the League of Nations. So just to give you a sense of what the attitude was then. And so it's not as if we haven't, in some respects, been here before. But where I want to end is in what ways things are not the same as they have been before. And unfortunately, I don't think I can make this end on a hopeful note. What we're dealing with today is not simply a return to American isolationism or retrenchment. Yes, I think I think Trump has benefited from a general feeling on the part of many Americans that we are too involved, that it's too expensive, that we're too much engaged in the rest of the world. But this is not a situation where America, as it was in the 1920s and 30s, was simply indifferent to what happens around the world. One of the luxuries that Americans have always enjoyed is the belief, and not entirely wrong belief, that they are so isolated and so self-sufficient that it really doesn't matter to them what happens in the rest of the world. And as I've argued, I do think it is the liberal impulse more than anything that has cut against that. So when you lose the liberalism and you have the traditional indifference, you get isolationism. But this is something different, because what America is, at least at the moment today, it is not an indifferent superpower, it's an anti-liberal superpower. And it's very important to understand the ideological element of the Trump administration. Trump himself is such an obvious narcissist, sort of megalomaniac. It's hard to associate ideas with him, and I wouldn't want to go too far in doing that. But his movement, the MAGA movement, the intellectual discourse of people like J.D. Vance, is highly ideological, and it is ideological in the sense that it is anti-liberal. And my book, Rebellion, I trace the origins of this, which, as I say, have been with the United States, have been present. This anti-liberal impulse has been present in the United States from the very beginning, and at various times it has gained ascendancy. But what we I think failed to understand is that from the 1930s till just recently, it was a period of liberal dominance in America. Conservatism of various kinds was discredited first by the Depression and then by World War II and the racial elements of World War II and the sense that Americans ought to be fighting for liberalism. And so that lasted for 80 years and I think buttressed much of what American foreign policy was. But today we have in power an anti-liberal administration. And what that means is, I'm afraid, I don't even think that the administration is content to be indifferent to Europe, because its anti-liberal mission has an international element. And you could see that, obviously, in Vance's Munich speech, but even more than that, in Vance's and Elon Musk's direct intervention into the politics of Germany and other countries on the European continent. That is not 1920s, 30s isolationist America. They didn't care what happened in European governments. This government, even though it is dismantling what some regard as the interventionist institutions like the National Endowment for the Democracy, a Voice of America, which were meddling in the internal affairs of other nations for the purpose of promoting liberalism, it would be one thing for a good, realist, isolationist administration to say we're not doing that anymore, but instead they have destroyed the pro-liberal institutions and are replacing them with an anti-liberal interventionist foreign policy. And where this leaves us, and I was in a panel earlier, a discussion earlier today where somebody pointed this out, is that Europe now faces, I would say potentially, but I think it's slightly more than potentially, the prospect of an aggressive, anti-liberal great power to its east in the form of Russia, and an aggressive, anti-liberal superpower to its west in the form of the United States. And it seems to me that that is a very dangerous position for liberal Europe to be in. And of course, Europe, of course, is more than just liberal Europe. It's also anti-liberal Europe. There are anti-liberals in Europe. Those forces can be supported and are being supported now, both by the United States and by Russia. And so that is the predicament that Europe finds itself in. And because the United States has now withdrawn in any meaningful sense, its security guarantee from everyone, and because the United States has adopted this posture, we are in fact moving into a multipolar world. And people have been predicting the turn to multipolarity for a long time, and I have been rejecting it, and I think rightly so. And I think the only thing that could have returned us to multipolarity is the decision by the United States to do what it is doing. And so let us not have the same kind of fantasies about what a multipolar world looks like that we had in the 1990s when all the problems seemed to be taken care of and humanity had moved on to a new stage. In a multipolar world, there is no freedom of the seas. In a multipolar world, there are spheres of influence in which many countries are subservient to the great powers. That's what it means to be a great power in a multipolar world. Much of the agenda of the liberal world order over the past few decades, whether it's climate or economic development or what have you, in a truly multipolar world, go back and look historically and see how many of those kinds of efforts were even contemplated in a genuine multipolar world that existed before World War II. The truth is that in a multipolar world, security is paramount. Everyone is reliant on themselves for security. Everyone is precarious. Everyone is in a precarious position. We're not used to that, at least those of us who've been living in the liberal order. But that is the world that lies ahead of us. And so I don't know if this is a hopeful note, but it is the note I'm going to end on because I'm here in the UK, I'm here in Europe, and what I would like to say to you is rearm. Europe and the liberal world and the UK now needs to take its own security in its own hands, and the fate of liberalism at this moment at least, and I don't want to get into, I don't know what's going to happen in the United States 2 years, 8 years, or 20 years from now, but I'm not optimistic enough not to tell you that if you want to preserve the liberalism that Europe has reached a kind of pinnacle of, you're unfortunately going to have to live in the world where force matters. And we need to get over the illusions of the post-Cold War period and realize that this is the world that we've moved into. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for this sobering expose. There's so much to chew upon, and I was just reminded when you said rearm that there must have been a similar conversation in Brussels when Ursula von der Leyen launched Rearm Europe. And then, of course, there were certain member states who said, no, this is a bad word. And the label we have now is Readiness 2030. Yeah. So rearmament is still not a great word in Brussels, but it might change, who knows. But on a more serious note, just two observations. The first, your very pertinent remark that this is an international wave of illiberalism. To put it in ideological terms, it's not illiberalism in one country. It's the permanent revolution flavor of illiberalism. But to play the devil's advocate, I'm just wondering if that's a utopian project in its own right. We had a great workshop on China-Europe, and one of the themes we played with was the notion of competing anti-liberalisms. The moment you remove the common enemy, you find all those differences. There's the Chinese version, there's the Trumpian version, certainly. Putin might be a fellow traveler, but it's not necessarily the same project. And I should also submit that the Orban style or Meloni style illiberalism might be having a life of its own. Not least because if you think about Orban, he's the one who inspires the Americans, but also is very capable of working with China as well, with Russia. And there's an illustrious tradition of anti-Americanism on the right or the far right in Europe as well. So can we talk about this world where actually you have competing nationalisms? I mean, let's use another word, because at the end of the day, all those projects are wedded to the nation state and to the notion of sovereignty and borders. So that's number one. Number two, going back to the world of McKinley or what have you, is it possible at a time when you have an American market, financial markets being so intertwined with the rest of the world, just pulling the drawbridge, that you have functional pressures to manage this interdependence? Another piece of data, of information, of course you can envision a situation where the exchange of goods globally declines, but the exchange of data is going up and up, and it all ties in with the world of artificial intelligence and cutting-edge technologies. So those illiberals, once they gain power, they have to operate in this environment. And how do they do that? I mean, how does Trump react to the market? How he reacts to new technologies? So that's a challenge they have to respond to, even in a post-liberal world.
Well, first of all, I didn't say that the Trump strategy would be successful for the United States. I think that if I wanted to talk on longer, I would talk about the way he is destroying American power. For one thing, American power was very much based on these alliance relationships. It wasn't simply, that's what I was trying to say. It wasn't simply that the United States was very powerful. It was the acceptance of that power by so many people, and partly because you could rely on the United States not to take advantage of this imbalance that was deliberately created after World War II, and that is precisely what the United States is doing now. I mean, as a result of the compact that we all sort of made in one way or another after World War II, America's allies left themselves extremely vulnerable to America. And now America is taking advantage of that vulnerability in a way that, is the worst kind of violation and betrayal of the trust that sat at the beginning of it. So I think that it is by the way, this is this is his métier, taking businesses and bankrupting them and then moving on to something else. I don't know unfortunately he doesn't have a country to move on to. But I don't doubt that he can destroy American power in this process. As opposed, and yes, on your first point, at least as I understood it, we have been living in a world that is divided between liberalism and anti-liberalism, because that is sort of the structure of the American order. But if the United States itself has turned away from that and has become anti-liberal, then we will be in a less ideologically divided, multipolar world. We'll be divided by all the things that you say that nation states are divided by. It raises interesting questions, which we've been discussing earlier, which is, can Europe overcome its very admirable liberal persuasion in order to make an arrangement with China if that is the most useful strategic thing for it to do. And I think Europe will in fact be faced with choices like that. We may not have the luxury of ideological consistency in a truly multipolar world.
Right. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience. I'll collect those in groups of 3. If you could please introduce yourself very briefly before you pose a question. And the gentleman over there.
Thank you, Dr. Lord Kagan, for that extraordinary presentation. I'm a Quaker, and therefore, when it comes to rearmament, we go a bit quiet. But there's one thing where the liberal world tells the truth, and the illiberal world doesn't mind whether they tell the truth or not. And their untruths are fed into our politics. Have you anything to say about truth?
I'm in favor of it.
Bob, let's
take a
collect
few,
some, I think there was, over there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. If we take...
Sorry, could you please mention your name?
My name is William Rome, and I'm a master's student at St Hugh's in history. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. If we take the most optimistic interpretation of how things could go in America politically after Trump, and I know there is no guarantee this is going to happen at all. If we take that most optimistic approach, do you see there is a way back to where we have been for the last 80 years? Or have they destroyed things so comprehensively that there is no turning back?
Well,
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
And there's Charles Grant over there.
Charles Grant, Centre for European Reform. You didn't say a lot about China, Bob, except a little bit at the end. In Brussels now, there are a lot of people saying, let's flirt with China a bit to make the Americans treat us with more respect. Let's kind of get a little bit, and even von der Leyen, who was very tough on China last year, is being a bit softer this year. How do you think Europe should handle China? I mean, I guess it boils down to what kind of anti-liberal country China is. Is it as rather like Trump or perhaps Putin, ideologically opposed to liberalism, in which case it won't want to get too close to the EU, or is it just totally focused on power and real politics, in which case it probably suits China's interest to flirt back with the Europeans to weaken the Atlantic Alliance and weaken America? How should we handle China?
Am I ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hegemon says that
These are all excellent questions. Let me just, I'll start with Charles. I would say that China is not in the same category in terms of the aggressive promotion of anti-liberalism in the same way that certainly Russia is, and that I think, at least in the, it's only been 3 months, but which the United States gives some indication of being. I know what motivates this administration, and it is engaged in an active rebellion against liberalism, and it's very much part and parcel of its self-justification, which is why I think it is going to be a bigger part of its foreign policy, because it's a real identity question, whereas China, at least up until now, has been less inclined to export, etc., and I don't think cares very much at the moment. It has its own, as you say, it's got a kind of its own realistic understanding of what's possible. Now, I do want to say that China, like everybody else, has until now been operating in an American-dominated world. And I don't want to predict what a China in a multipolar world in which there will always be ideological competition. Let me just say something about that, by the way. The Westphalian order is a myth. There was never a Westphalian order. Nations have always engaged in first of all, ideologically or it's either ideology or religion, but it's mostly about belief. Beliefs have always shaped both internal and foreign policy, I would argue. Now, sometimes you have to suspend it for certain purposes, but I do think it's a constant. So I would expect in a multipolar world, there will still be ideological conflict, but I think it might take a back seat to the security elements of a multipolar world, in which case I could see China, soft pedaling in theory, its anti-liberalism in the interest of finding a community of interest with Europe. By the way, I don't think there's ever going to be an alliance or even anything structural, but a community of interest with Europe. The only question I have is China actually capable of of approaching Europe in a way that Europe can find acceptable. I would say China has been pretty ham-handed in its approach, but maybe, but the opportunity for China to step in as the good superpower or the good great power when your choice is Russia or the United States is certainly there. Whether the Chinese are capable sort of constitutionally of seizing that opportunity, I just don't know what the answer is. The other question was, can we come back? Interestingly, the United States, as I say, we really quite underestimate the degree of how badly the United States behaved in the 1920s and 30s. I do hold the United States at least partially, if not substantially, responsible for the breakdown of order in Europe and the eventual war. If the United States had played the role that it had promised to play after World War I, I'm not sure we would have had World War II. But in any case, the bitterness was very great. And yet, by 1945 and etc., the United States was forgiven for that, and there was a possibility of unity. So, if the United States completely changed complexion and returned to what it has been, the thing about countries is they have immediate needs. And if the United States can answer those immediate needs for people, then they will be more inclined to forgive. But I don't know if America's allies can ever get over this betrayal in the sense of really, truly doing what they had done throughout this period, which is leave themselves exposed to the United States and leave themselves so dependent on the United States that if the United States takes a bad turn, that they're not incredibly vulnerable, which is what they are right now. So that's why I would encourage, even if the United States is going to go back to being the good old United States, that's why I still want Europe to be strong enough so that the United States is dealing with somewhat more of an equal partner. Let's advance liberalism together, not in quite as dependent a relationship. On the truth question, you're at a philosophical level that's beyond me. I guess I do feel like, I'm sure people in other societies would say liberals also lie and also spread falsehoods, and that spreading falsehood is part of human existence, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that anti-liberal regimes have a monopoly on it, but there's no question that we live in this, and increasingly and frighteningly in an information age where deception and disinformation is going to be more and more possible, which is to say, by the way, a return to normal. I mean, it used to be that there was no common news source, and if someone said the Pope had fathered an illegitimate child, and therefore we need to go to war, nobody knew whether that was true or it wasn't true. Probably it was true. But so we're in a way back to a world in which we don't know what the truth is, or we don't agree on what the truth is. That was not a world conducive to peace and liberalism, which I think is your point. But I do think that is where we seem to be headed right now.
Well, the truth is on Truth Social, but just 2 fingers on the second question. If you look at many European leaders, they somehow seem to believe that they can condition or lobby or influence US behavior. Meloni going to Trump, even Zelensky, he did a decent job in tweaking this infamous agreement. So is that a worldwide pursuit or fool's errand, given the structural dynamics at play, that you could actually affect US behavior through various means?
No, I think you can tactically. He's clearly capable of being charmed or flattered mostly though he will respond to financial gift, of one form or another. And you can buy that, you can buy some goodwill or time or whatever. But you have to understand that, so much of American foreign policy has been based on some unquestioned premises about the nature of our relationships with our allies. Those assumptions no longer exist. So every transaction is a blank slate. There's no sense that, well, I ought to be good because they're an ally. He doesn't even look at the world as allies and not allies. I believe he looks at the world as what can I get here and what can I get there. And also, for him, it's all about his personal power. These tariffs, I'm sure he has an economic theory behind them, but the real theory behind them is power. because by exacting these tariffs, first of all, domestically, he's in a position of granting favors to industries or corporations that are being burdened by these tariffs. So everyone has to turn to him constantly. And I think in terms of dealing with the rest of the world, that may be true also. You may strike a deal with Trump this year on tariffs, and he'll turn around next year and demand more. And the notion of what it's like to deal with someone whose depiction of tariff negotiations is they're all coming to kiss my ass, and yes, sir, please don't do this to us, sir. That is the clearest glimpse. If you want to know what motivates Donald Trump, it is that statement. And I think that unfortunately bodes ill for the normal kind of international interaction that we are used to.
Ezgi.
Thank you. I wonder how you can explain the velocity, the speed of the authoritarianism. I mean, you just said at the beginning of your talk that your country is going into dictatorship, while it's just 100 days. So even Putin, Erdogan, the brothers of authoritarianism that we know, had gone through several obstacles. The speed is amazing. I mean, what does it say about the ironclad checks and balances and the very strong institutions of the United States?
Could you introduce yourself, who you are?
My name is Ezgi Başar, and I'm a scholar of the Middle East politics.
Well,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. There was another question over there.
Yes, hello. David Steinsaltz, professor of statistics. Thank you for your sobering assessment. So, I mean, what you're saying is that it's the impulse that still exists for Europeans to depend on American security guarantees, such as they are, is foolish. And I guess I'm wondering, you were inclined to read back into and say it was always foolish, but presumably there was a time when it was rational. So I'm wondering, when do you think Europeans should have realized that they need to rearm?
Well, for those of you who know me, when I wrote the book in 2003, published the book in 2003, my argument to Europe then was that Europe needed to rearm because again, it's a worldview question. If you think that we're beyond power, which was a very popular idea, then you don't need to rearm. But my argument all along, and then too, was I'm sorry, everything that you're enjoying as the fruits of our time are the result ultimately of power, that there were things being done by power. And so if you want to continue to pursue this, you're going to need power too. And I thought it was then an unequal relationship. So I think all along, now, should the Europeans have treated the United States with distrust for 80 years and basically regarded itself as an opponent of the United States? No. But I do think it would have been better for Europe in dealing with this betrayal if Europe had been in a stronger position to begin with, and now it has to play catch-up. And maybe it can play catch-up. It's a very rich continent. It's really a question of how many sacrifices do Europeans want to make? I mean, something has to give. And Europe, as the conservative critics like to say, they've created a very nice life for themselves under the American security umbrella. And there's always been a question, are they willing to sacrifice some elements of that life to create their own security? And that I think is the question. So, but certainly going forward, whatever, I don't want to, I'm not casting blame backwards, because I don't blame them for not anticipating this particular American move. But going forward, I think the lesson should be well learned. On the rapidity of it, yes, of course. I mean, I happen to be in the position of having predicted that this was going to happen. I mean, I wrote this in November of 23, that this is where I thought we were going. So I'm less shocked than some people as to what has happened. In terms of the speed of it, I'm throwing this out as part of an explanation. One reason that it's gone so fast is there's no United States, in the sense that previous authoritarians like Putin had to move carefully, not just because they couldn't consolidate at home, but because there was a big superpower out there that was watching them very closely and was inclined to oppose this effort. And I think just as Hitler, had to move cautiously at first, he tried to reassure the Americans in particular that he was not going to be a bad guy, just as Mussolini had his good decade before he became as aggressive. They've been feeling their way. If you're Donald Trump, there is no United States to worry about, so you can go as fast as you want. And then, as far as the checks and balances are concerned, I mean, this is the problem. The checks and balances, Americans acted like the checks and balances are like a machine that as soon as you press the alert button, they go like this. But of course, the checks and balances are us. We have to make these decisions, and we have to stand up for principles. And all I can tell you is we used to. If you read about the American founders, they spend a lot of time in a total panic about whether this is going to work. There's Benjamin Franklin, a republic if you can keep it. They were really worried. And guess what? They were right. Because at the end of the day, the American system is a voluntary compact, and it really does depend, as the founders understood, on a certain level of what they called virtue, which is to say the American people had to want this system and be willing to take action to defend it, because there was nobody else to do it. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that a great number of Americans who are not MAGA, they are not Trump devotees, but they are insufficiently concerned about the status of rights in our country. They're more concerned with what they have to complain about than understanding what the foundation of this system is. I would also say, by the way, that political parties, which the founders did not anticipate, and which for most of our history have been beneficial in channeling radicalism in a useful direction, in this case have failed us. The checks and balances are like the Titanic, in the sense that, it's like the Titanic had these walls, so that even if you punctured one of them, the rest of them would hold, and the iceberg went across all of them. And that's what political parties have done. When it became the case, which is fairly recent, decades, maybe a few decades, that a Republican Congress did not stand up for the rights of Congress, but instead acted as servants of a Republican president, and Democrats on the same side as well. The founders assumed that Congress would be so jealous of its powers vis-a-vis the executive that nothing would make them give it up. Similarly, the Supreme Court. You can't tell me that the Supreme Court is not being shaped by partisan politics and by pro-Trump justices who were pretty much, that's how we got that decision on immunity last year. So once again, party and partisanship has cut across all three branches, and like the Titanic has severed these walls that were preventing the sinking.
Well, the founding fathers, they were inspired by the example of antiquity, but it was the decline and fall version.
Yeah.
So they really were bothered about decay of the institutions, and that's just to echo what you had to say. But let's collect more, over there, and Ellen Dahrendorf.
Thank you. My name is Simon Fraser. I'm the chairman of Chatham House. I wonder if you could say something about the attitude of American multinational corporates who, after all, underpin a lot of American power, drive the American economy, drive the global economy, and many of which, not all, but many of which sort of espouse liberal values. How are they going to deal with this sort of evolution of the American polity that you're describing?
Well, I don't know how they're going to.
Sorry, Bob.
I'm sorry.
Hold your fire.
I'm sorry.
I think. Yeah. So, Ellen, and then the gentleman.
Ellen Dahrendorf. My question is.
Hold on, Ellen.
Ellen Dahrendorf. My question is similar to the one or follow-up of Simon Fraser's. There's one aspect of power that it seems to me you've left out of your talk, which is fairly recent, although it might have been similar in the 1890s. And that is, well, it used to be Davos man, but now it's Tech Brothers man, the huge wealth of these technological billionaires who have affected elections, who are partly responsible for this Republican Congress that is so supine. Where do you put that? And it's international. It's not just in America. Where do you put, and social media, of course, where do you put all that in your analysis?
And lastly, I have a question over here.
Thanks very much. Ben Hall from the Financial Times. I wanted to come back to China, if I may, with respect to the experts. You talked a little bit about China and Europe, but I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about, in the view of this oscillation in US foreign policy, about US policy towards China and where you think this administration will go in terms of, or whether the idea of US containment, confrontation with China will go, because after all, that is probably going to shape Europe's future, probably even more than confrontation with Russia, certainly economically.
Am I allowed to speak?
Of course.
Well, let me start with China because, again, we're dealing with Donald Trump here, and right now it has become very convenient for him to take one strand of policy and enormously exaggerate it, and that is the anti-China approach. And this is, in a certain sense, this is part of his retreat on the tariff front, so that, he's tried to reshape his war against the world, which is what his tariff policies really are, into a war designed to isolate China. And so in that respect, and in the Republican Party, there's a level of China paranoia, I would say. And I say this as someone has spent many years warning about the growth of China. I oppose China's entry into the MFN, into WTO, giving it MFN. So I have all that black background behind me. But even I believe that and the thing that I worry about Republicans is that it's a paranoia that's mostly domestically aimed. And there's going to be a lot of talk about Chinese spying and Chinese sympathizers. And they even use this term, red comm simps or something like that. They pulled this out of the McCarthy period and it's back. So there's a lot of sort of political and a need to make China an enemy right now. However, Trump could turn around tomorrow and cut a trade deal with China, and then all his minions will be all for whatever all that was. So I don't think this is a situation where you can safely predict which way this is going to go. And I don't know, just watching from the outside, I would say the Chinese are predicting that Trump is going to fold because they think they're tougher than we are, and they're right. The funny thing about using tariffs, if you're the United States, is that theoretically the United States has overwhelming leverage over everybody. But in practice, our political system is such that merely by targeting a particular constituency, a particular industry that is meaningful to Donald Trump, it can do tremendous damage. And then we already see him backing off in all kinds of ways because of the effect on domestic industries that ultimately affect voters. So I would be wary of making any sort of broad prediction about the long-term trend. And honestly, this gets to the inconsistency at the heart of the Trump administration's foreign policy, because on the one hand, they are sort of isolationist. They don't think we should be involved in the rest of the world. On the other hand, they're allegedly building their entire defense strategy around defending Taiwan. The America First people of the 1930s would have thought that was an absolutely insane thing to even think about. And so, they're an isolationist superpower that likes the superpower part, if you know what I mean. So that's why it would be difficult to be very predictive about where they're going. On the multinational corporations and the tech bros, there are some tech bros, obviously, who have an ideological axe to grind here, like Peter Thiel, etc., and the whole idea that democracy is a hindrance to technological and human development, etc. And I think that is there. But I think that is much more of a fringe in the overall movement. They fund it. They fund J.D. Vance, etc., and that's true. But when you look at corporate titans in general, they're like corporate titans at all times. When the elephants start rumbling, they head for the mouse holes. And the truth is that most, somebody wrote an article in the Times saying if you talk to them privately, most corporate heads don't like Donald Trump. And yet, because he was clearly going to hold all the power, and because they know that he's a vindictive guy who will punish anybody that has crossed him, they immediately began genuflecting. And, the best example of this is Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon once called me because I'd been criticizing him along these lines, and he said, off the record, I don't like Donald Trump. It's like, first of all, off the record, I'm not. Anyway, but the point is that it's mostly that there's power and there's power, and economic power only in the political system only takes you so far. The truth is that Donald Trump in the United States wields real power. He can't be spooked by Jamie Dimon. He can be spooked by the bond market, which is an impersonal sort of. There's no, you can't negotiate with the bond market in theory, right? But as far as his relationship with these corporate titans, they know who's in charge. In the same way that the corporate titans in Russia also figured out or had it explained to them who was in charge.
Right. I think Arthur had a question. And then I'll move here and over there.
Thank you. Arthur Anastasakis from the European Studies Center. I just wanted to ask you very quickly your opinion about the Democrats and what kind of opposition is there? What's wrong with them?
So there's a question over there.
Well, thank you very much. Does that work? Sorry. Yes, thank you very much. Matthias Klaus of the German Embassy, but don't blame anybody else for what I'm saying. In my view, everybody seems to be pessimistic, but you, I think, in the first half and 2/3 of your talk, you made me very optimistic, and I actually don't share your introductory sort of provocation. Well, that's just a comment. But my question is really, you talked about the liberal order, and the liberal order in an ideal conceptual form of the 1990s, where everything looked perfect. But you yourself have repeatedly questioned the concept of power and, let's say, the power and the newer version in the liberal order, and in fact, what is the foundation of the order? And you didn't use the term, but in international language, we very often use the term rules-based order. And that is the kind of illusion I would have thought so far, in your view, that actually, in fact, the order doesn't keep up itself. So somebody has to keep up the order. And I was wondering if you could comment on this a little bit. What is the liberal order really perfect as we think of it, or doesn't it have to be really changed, improved, because it has shown weak parts, globalization, etc.
So I'll take two more questions on this side. Natalie Sabanadze and then Timothy Gartanash.
Thank you, Dimo. Natalie Sabanadze, Chatham House. I'm interested in the relationship of different origin anti-liberalisms. So you have coming anti-liberalism from Russia with its traditional values that had quite attraction. And that had served Russia as an important ideological instrument to project influence. And now all these Russia clients, basically in the neighborhood across Europe, are looking at Trump with great excitement. And this kind of blunted Russia's instrument of power projection. So I'm curious how these great powers are going to compete while sharing the belief. And linked to this is the question of contagion. Do you think this trend is contagious, and can Europe survive as a liberal island in this case?
Mm-hmm. And then Timothy.
Timothy Gartanash, European Studies Center. Bob, I think I've discovered the great optimism at the end of your talk, because the story you're telling is that we face all around us the forces of anti-liberalism. Anti-liberalism from the East, anti-liberalism from the West, anti-liberalism from the South, from inside and from outside. Well, that assumes that there's still a big major force called liberalism against which everyone unites. In other words, it is the organizing center of the ideological aspects of this dangerous multipolar world. So justify your infectious optimism about the future of liberalism.
Well, thank you, Tim. The last two questions are lead in the same direction, so let me do those first. First of all, if you ask me what the origins of anti-liberalism are, it's the human being. And I think that we have, and this was certainly very prevalent in the 1990s, had a teleological understanding of human existence where we're on our way up to liberalism. When in reality, liberalism has been the briefest, most fragile experiment in human history. I mean, you can't, the basic principles of liberalism, which are about elevating the rights of the individual over those of the state. That is ultimately that's the core of liberalism, is the most rare concept in history. And therefore, what I've always argued, and I argued this more in a book called The Jungle Grows Back, is that we collectively had created something of a miracle of this sort of liberal existence, which, and then it continued to evolve. And I'll work in the rules-based order question just because I would say within the American liberal order, in the terms of the ways that the United States and its allies and its partners dealt with each other, it was pretty rules-based. Yes, the United States operated according to a double standard because at the end of the day, the United States had to be able to wield power in such a way as to keep the liberal order together, which was different, which meant that the United States did not, certainly in terms of international law, the United States was not a rules-based entity, and it certainly didn't insist on getting a UN Security Council resolution every time it wanted to use force, et cetera, et cetera. But within the order, within the liberal order, which is bounded by Europe and Asia in various different places, I do think it was largely rules-based. And whether that could be universalized is an interesting question. I guess I'm skeptical that it could be universalized, but in any case, it wasn't. In terms of liberalism itself, if the war had gone differently in World War II, I don't know what would have been left of liberalism. And so, I would love to say what you're saying, that the liberal flame always lives on, but, after the Roman Empire, people forgot how to make cement. These things can be lost, and I do think that the general tendencies of humanity work against the success of liberalism, and that the really titanic struggle is to preserve liberalism. So I do worry that in a world where the only defenders of liberalism are going to be located in a few discrete places who do not wield predominant power in the international system, that it's going to be very hard to sustain, even if the desire, do I think that Europe's going to cease to be liberal next year, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? But if the trends continue on their present course, I think it's going to be a real challenge. Again, in the 1930s, people believed that democracy was finished. People believed that fascism was the future. Anne Morrow Lindbergh said, fascism is the future. Joseph Kennedy, who was the ambassador to the UK at the time, said, democracy is finished. And so it's only, as a result of 80 years that we could come to the conclusion that liberalism will always be there. But I think, I'm afraid, I think it's more fragile than that. But if you can find hope in what I've said, then I think that's wonderful.
All right, I'll abuse the prerogative of the chairman and ask you a question. You gaze your crystal ball. J.D. Vance is the president. What sort of America and what sort of world we got out there? But hold your fire. I'll get the question from on top there, and then the gentleman over here. Oh yeah, of course. There's the Democrats, but.
Yeah, you noticed I was ducking that question, right? Democrats. Look, in the same way that I think the world is not ready for this anti-liberal rebellion in the United States, I don't think Democrats were ready for it either. And, they definitely got tagged with a certain kind of liberal approach, which I think was really not fair. You know, a lot of the things that Trump made a big deal out of, like transgender issues, it wasn't like the Democratic Party had transgender issues as its leading plank. I mean, these were issues specifically chosen by Trump to put Democrats in an awkward position, because if you're a liberal, you have to believe in everyone's rights. But if that's an unpopular group, then you're on the wrong side of the political equation. And the problem is, I would say, that too many Americans, that's the bottom line, is that too many Americans had either turned against liberalism or no longer thought liberalism was valuable. And the Democratic Party, let's face it, is the party of liberalism in the United States. It's also the party of illiberalism in its own ways, etc. But it is that coalition is the coalition of groups that particularly have focused on the need for universal individual rights, whether it's blacks, or other minorities, women, etc. And so insofar as the country sort of, at least the country, 48 point whatever % of the country was fed up with that in some way or had other reasons for why they didn't care about that, the Democrats are on the wrong side of where the American people are. You know, it's a tough place to be. I don't think it's going to last, and I think that the way, you know, again, if we had a free democratic system still intact, which I very much question at this point, if we had, Trump's popularity rating has plummeted. You know, most Americans don't want anything that Trump is doing. And so that would be reflected in an election, and then we wouldn't be talking about how stupid the Democrats are. They would be winning elections, and then they'd be great again. But the fact is that at this particular time, many Americans have shown that they lack the virtue that the founders wanted them to have, and I don't know who to blame for that other than the American people. At the end of the day, we used to say this about other countries: you get the government you deserve. And to some extent, you have to say the American people have gotten the government that they deserve.
Well, now that the Europeans are transitioning from Venus to Mars, we are waving the flag for
Go get them.
Demartian. But over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Arthur. I'm a MPhil student in history here. My question goes in a similar direction to Dr. Bechev's question. Could you please sketch how you think a potential anti-liberal interventionist Vance administration would react to successful and significant strides towards liberal European strategic autonomy? Thanks.
Or maybe, should I ask another dimension, another scenario? It's the 2026 midterm elections. Democrats win big, or bigly. And then from Mr. lame duck, there's all kinds of cold intrigue, I Claudius style, if you remember Grace's book. So how that affects America in the world, this disarray and Washington dysfunction and Republicans in free fall. But let's get another question. The gentleman was waiting patiently. And
Thank you. Julius Krak, Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Your conclusion was very much that Europe needs to not only rearm itself, but be more self-confident. In that spirit, I wanted to ask, is there anything a self-confident Europe could do to support those fighting for liberalism in the US, if anything?
I mean, am I allowed to answer that question? That's a tricky answer to ask me, and so I'm not going to. I don't really particularly have an answer, but I do think that insofar as those who are liberals around the world continue, they should make clear what their views are about what's happening in the United States. I must say I find the opposite is largely true, because every national leader is concerned about their relationship with Donald Trump for understandable reasons. So they're hardly in criticism mode, and therefore, you know, the United States, for instance, is not facing the kind of international pressure that if another democracy of this substantial importance were moving toward dictatorship, you can be sure that the United States in the previous incarnation would be leading an international effort to try to do something, you know, but that is not the situation that we're in now, which is one reason I find all this so so one of the many reasons I find the trend so worrying. I think most other nations in the world are going to try to figure out how they can get along with Donald Trump, not how they can oppose it. So we'll see. What was the other point?
Well, there was a point about the future.
Oh, yeah, right. That was the point I was really going to punt on. Look, I don't know whether a week from now Donald Trump is going to say, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, I'm doing it anyway. I don't know if by the time 2026 rolls around, Congress will have any power at all, so that it won't matter who controls Congress. Congress has already ceded a huge, almost all of its fundamental power. It's ceded the power of the purse to Elon Musk and Russell Vought and the president. And so maybe a Democratic House could restore some of that, but they're going to have to claw it back. And I don't know how successful they can be, because I don't know how far Donald Trump, this is where we all are, I don't know how far Donald Trump is willing to go in terms of overriding the various elements of the system. And so therefore, I can't predict to you what's going to happen in 2026. I don't even know, I couldn't tell you for certain that we're going to have free and fair elections in 2026. I can well imagine a situation where the fact that the administration will be controlling everything, the Federal Elections Commission, all kinds of investigative capabilities, etc. Somebody has to pronounce on the fairness of an election. I don't know what the administration is going to do on that. So you want to talk to me about 2028? Some of you have pointed out, look what's happened in 100 days. What's going to happen in what's left now? 1,400 more days before we even are at the end of the Trump administration. So I am going to punt. All I can say is there is obviously tremendous opposition building in the United States to many of the things Trump is doing, including, most importantly, on his self-inflicted disaster, which is the completely unnecessary decision to tank the American economy in the interest of these tariffs. Now, as I say, I do think that tariffs are a form of power for Trump, which is one of his motivations. But nevertheless, he has certainly done himself no favors if he cares about public opinion. And unfortunately, I think that is still, the jury is out.
So I have 4 people in the next round. Galip, Dalai, then we have Janke, Stephanie, Flanders. Arsene, did you have a question as well? Okay, so the 4 of you.
Well, thank you very much. Galip Dalai, St. Anthony's College and Chatham House. I think Europe is not only have to rearm itself, probably it has to even reinvent itself. Because the 2 foundational assumptions of the European project is no longer there. There is no geopolitical West, because it was it was the US that created the geopolitical West, post-1945, with NATO particularly, and there is no normative West, now that we are no longer talking about the West of norms and the West of the rules. And given this, if post-Trump Democrats, so if you look at the post-Trump Democrats, if they come to the power, will they remain as committed to engage with the world and to remain committed to the world, or will they become also more isolationist and compete with Trump on domestic fronts? Because if they don't remain committed to the world, even if Trump goes, I think the geopolitical and normative West probably will still be off the horizon for a long time, and probably it's not the US and it's not the middle powers, and then the US will create a real multipolar world.
Hey, Galip, introduce yourself.
Galip Dalai, St. Anthony's College and Chatham House.
Okay, Janke.
Janke Oertel, European Council on Foreign Relations. I would just like to poke you a little bit on the China question, because I was trying to do this logical thing, one sentence doesn't fit, when you have 4 and one doesn't fit quite right. So if I understand you correctly, then a liberal Europe should rearm to its teeth, fight for liberalism, and potentially lead a coalition against the United States, because that's what's needed. And then you add work with China. That, for me, is the one that is sort of doesn't quite fit in the equation. I would like you to elaborate on that, because if we assume that this is probably one of the most illiberal forces out there, the largest economic competitor that Europe currently faces, the one country that has already massively intervened in Europe's integrity and has probably the largest potential to split the Europeans apart. How on earth do you think that one will fit into the logical kind of sequence that you have put out?
Stephanie's.
Stephanie Flanders from Bloomberg. One thing you haven't talked about so much is the sources of this anti-liberal tide that we've had hitting all these countries. And obviously, everyone has their own preferred explanation, and people tend to talk about globalization, or they talk about culture wars, and you've referenced to some of those, and they've obviously been used to the advantage of these also particular individuals who've come along who might not have come along. But I guess we need to have a bit of an understanding of that to then think about the sort of forward-looking question of what could possibly bring us back our virtue, inspire a bit more of sort of desire for liberalism. And I guess the two categories of things would be, failure of the anti-liberals to deliver on these things that people are looking for now. And I think the failure of Brexit, at least some of us felt, at least temporarily inoculated the UK, because people had very visibly seen this populist claims be debunked. I don't know if it's going to last, but that's one thing. But then, of course, the other thing that could change things is for liberal governments that still exist to actually start delivering for people. It's hard for them to enter the sort of arms race on immigration and on some of these things. As you've pointed out, they've kind of got one hand behind their back. But are there other areas where you think you could change the sources of this illiberalism in the popular area?
Hassan.
Thanks. My question is related to your view on a very cynical theory that, as you call them, the economic elites are subservient to Trump, but to a large extent, especially the IT elites were responsible for his rise through social media and misinformation. To what extent, once they get their permanent tax cut, would they drop him and say, let's go back to a normal world order where we can make money and not quarrel with everybody and spend too much on weapons?
Can you say...
Hassan Vasilev, Deputy Chair of the Budget Committee of the Bulgarian Parliament right now.
Is it my turn? Okay. Let me answer the most aggressive question first on China. Look, I'm not calling on, first of all, I didn't call for a coalition against the United States, and I'm not asking Europe to lead a coalition against the United States. I'm mostly interested in Europe's survival. And so what I'm mostly talking about is kind of a negative recommendation rather than seeking a positive alliance with an anti-liberal dictatorship, which China is. And I also think, by the way, that China has been a relatively cautious power in the American-dominated world. I don't know if it would continue to be as cautious in a world where those constraints are not there, and that's something I will leave to others to answer. But it seems to me that at least from a purely sort of cold geostrategic point of view, and this is a contingency, if you are worried about the United States using its power, but let's be very specific about this. Trump has said he wants Greenland. If Trump takes Greenland, that is an act of aggression against a European ally. I don't know what the Europeans' response to that will be, other than to say, bummer, sorry that happened. But I don't rule out the possibility that there'd be quite a stir, including on behalf of the Danes, who are fellow European allies, at which point, Europe will even be more incentivized, as they say, to try to adopt some kind of position in the world that can defend itself. In that regard, participating in the American effort to isolate and weaken China, from a European point of view, in a multipolar world, it doesn't strike me that it's obvious that that's in Europe's interest. I don't know what I'm missing here, because as far as I understand, what China does in Asia has an impact on everybody, obviously, but Europe has never regarded, not since the end of World War II, regarded East Asia a place where it wanted to deploy forces, for instance. It was letting the United States take care of that. And it seems to me that Europe has very much bought into what the United States wants to do vis-a-vis China more than it might have done on its own. I have to say, with all due respect, you're on the hawkish side, it seems to me, in the European conversation. You're not the mainstream of the European view. And I think the European view is that they would have traded more with China if it had not been for the global implications of that, which is to say, participating in upholding an American world order from which Europeans benefited. I'm trying to imagine a world where Europeans no longer see any benefits in a non-existent American world order, but do fear great powers on their flanks. Historically, the distant enemy is my friend against the near enemy. And so, again, I'm not suggesting that there be an alliance, but would it really not be in Europe's interest if you had an aggressive, hostile America for the United States to be more distracted in Asia rather than less distracted in Asia? Anyway, that's all I would say. Believe me, this is what the problem is right now. No part of me at any time over the past whatever decades has ever said, Europe, please rush into the arms of China. Okay? What I'm trying to do is think past where we've been to where we're going. And it may be that this is never going to happen. And in fact, listening to you and others over the past couple of days, I can see why it maybe is never going to happen. But then, you do stand the danger of not hanging together, but hanging separately. And so, again, I don't know that this is the right move for Europe or not, but obviously Europe needs to start thinking. It would not be the first time that a power united with an ideological adversary against a common threat. Like, for instance, the United States and the Soviet Union. For instance, the United States and China. So the notion that it's inconceivable that Europe could move in a direction that all other great powers in history, including Europeans, have moved in, that strikes me as a pretty extreme position on your part, actually. So, on the sources of anti-liberalism, I'm sure there has been an economic dimension to the rise of anti-liberalism, but here I feel more comfortable talking about Americans rather than Europeans, because Europe has its own history and its own causes and its own traditions of anti-liberalism. But I know what the traditions of anti-liberalism in America are about, and they are about, first and foremost, race, second, religion, and third, and most recently, gender. I believe that there's a lot in this election that was a male response to the rise of the rights of women. And, it just so happens, and I don't think this is an accident, comrades, that if you see a white male walking down the street in the United States, you have pretty much a 60 to 70% chance that person voted for Donald Trump. And I know that blacks also voted for Trump more than they used to, but it was still infinitesimal. And so I think if you ask me the one word that describes what people were voting against, it was woke. This was the woke election, and that's why Trump got people to support him that normally I don't think necessarily would have supported him, because he touched something that was very deep in people, that they'd been told they couldn't say this and they couldn't do that, and they were tired of it. And when he said, grab the blah, 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 I can't tell you, a lot of men in America were like, I like that. I wish the world were like that still. I'm sorry to say that, because we don't want to think that anybody has bad motives. But I'm telling you, in the United States, it was not the economy. Yes, they picked up on the fact that there was inflation. Yes, we were in a post-pandemic situation. But look at the way they've responded. Trump supporters have responded now. And he is losing support around those marginal people. But the fact is, his movement, and if you listen to what J.D. Vance said in his acceptance speech, which is really important, because this is a fight in the United States, which again goes back to the founding, between an ethno-religious definition of the United States and an idealistic definition of the United States. Either the United States is based on an idea, which is the principles of the Declaration of Independence, or it's based on white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. And when J.D. Vance said, they're including the Catholics now for some reason, although they never did before, when J.D. Vance said, America is not just an idea, that's what he was getting at. And when he talks about the fact that his family has been buried for 7 generations in Kentucky or whatever state it is, that is about blood and soil nationalism. That is what they're selling. They're selling white nationalism. This is predominantly a white Christian nationalist movement is at the core. And I just don't think it's about economics. So therefore, I don't know I don't know how you educate people again. I'll tell you what did happen. If you go back, this did happen before. America was much more racist, much more restrictive, much more filled with prejudice in the 1920s and 30s, and 1920s especially, than it even is today. And what changed it? Well, 2 things changed it. One was the Depression, which discredited a certain kind of conservative Republican approach to things, and they were very much the bastion of white Protestant Christian, they had those votes. And the second thing, and even more importantly, was World War II, which ultimately became a war against racism, and it discredited all kinds of racist theories that were very dominant in the United States. In the 1930s, eugenics was a very respectable thing. Sam Huntington's father was the president of the American Eugenics Society, and we forget all that. We've whitewashed, so to speak, our history. And so we forget how often anti-liberalism has been dominant. And by the way, it rose in the 1920s at a time of economic boom that Americans had never seen before. So to look for a straight car, we're such Marxists. Everything has got to have an economic cause. But I really do think in this case, again, speaking for Americans, and my understanding of Europe is it was immigration, not economics, that really spurred this movement and continues to spur it. So I don't know what you do about how to fix that problem.
So,
have I exhausted you yet? No, not yet.
Well, there were a few questions, including about business.
Oh, I didn't answer all the questions, right.
And then we have to wrap up, I'm afraid, because we are running the clock. But if you could...
Will the tech and corporate people abandon Trump when he destroys the economy? I mean, he's destroying the economy now, and they keep hoping that he eventually changes his mind. I mean, these are people who didn't think he was going to do tariffs, and then were shocked to find out that he did want to do tariffs. And then now, and then the minute he said, well, maybe I will back off for a while, then the market goes up 2,000 points. This guy basically is going in a certain direction, and no one wants to admit it. And so I don't know how bad things have to get before corporate titans. Now, they could be out of a job before they figure it out, is the real answer. But I don't trust them. They are not in a position to wield enough power to change the direction of the United States politically, no matter how badly things are going economically. What's going to change the political direction of the country is that the mass of Americans are feeling that they are suffering terribly under these policies. It is going to be a popular resistance, not corporate titans saying, hey, we're not making enough money anymore, so we're going to overthrow this guy. They have knelt to him. They are beholden to him. They don't have the courage. They do not act as political figure. They don't act as people who are citizens of the United States. They act as people who are getting paid for making money, and they're going to keep doing it as long as they can.
So at this point, I'm afraid I have to exercise my arrogant imperial powers to shut it down. But before I do that, to wave the flag of liberalism, I go back to our founding father, if you will. So Ralph Dahrendorf also said that liberalism is not the creed of answers, it's a creed of questions. And it insists no one has the final truth, and that institutions must be built to live with uncertainty. And we have plenty of uncertainty in this world today, but also we have plenty of questions, and we all owe great debt to Bob being here with us. Not offering much hope, but certainly offering a lot of food for thought, and we owe him a dinner as well. So join me in
happy almost weekend. Welcome. Programming note as a reminder, not that you need to got the white balance having a little problem there on camera, I think. Just as a reminder, which you don't need to be reminded of, tomorrow the UN headquarters will be closed, given that it's an official holiday in our host country. It is their Independence Day, and we wish them a happy Independence Day. We will be back here on Monday, and as usual during the weekends and holidays, we will unfortunately remain available to you if you have any questions. Also, just on the technical side, over the weekend, a number of our web platforms, including Web TV, the UN News, all the UN photo and video, will be undergoing scheduled maintenance as they're moving from one hosting platform to another. On the back end, there should not be any problems, but if there are, I would just ask you to be a little bit patient. Travel announcement regarding the Secretary General. On Saturday, July 5th, the Secretary General will be arriving in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to attend the 17th summit of the BRICS countries. The Secretary General has been invited to speak at an outreach session on strengthening multilateralism, economic, financial affairs, and artificial intelligence. That will take place on Sunday, July 6th. On Monday, on the 7th, he will address the second outreach session on environment, COP30, and global health. During his visit, the Secretary General will also be having meetings with various leaders who are attending the BRICS summit, and we will share those readouts with you. Our Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, returned to Sevilla today for the closing of the fourth international conference on financing for development. At the closing, the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez of Spain, she attended the closing along with the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. During her remarks, she underscored the consensus around the Sevilla Agreement as a demonstration of multilateralism in action, with actions to close the SDG financing gap, address the debt crisis, and reform the international financial architecture. She recognized the more than 100 initiatives launched on the Sevilla platform for action, including solidarity levies on private jets and first-class travel to generate new resources for sustainable development. She said that the UN will be operationalizing a Seville forum on debt to help countries learn from one another and coordinate their approaches in debt management and restructuring, and that forum will be supported by the government of Spain, and we thank them. She called for the conference to be remembered not only as a conference that responded to crisis, but as the moment the world chose cooperation over fragmentation, unity over division, and action over inertia. Tomorrow, she will travel to Praia in Cabo Verde to take part in the celebration marking the 50th anniversary of the country's independence. And I have a statement to share with you on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I can tell you that the Secretary General is appalled by the deepening humanitarian situation in Gaza. Multiple attacks in recent days hitting sites hosting displaced people and people trying to access food have killed and injured scores of Palestinians. The Secretary General condemns the loss of civilian life. In just one day this week, Israeli orders to relocate forced nearly 30,000 people to flee yet again with no safe place to go and clearly inadequate supplies of shelter, of food, of medicine, and of water. International humanitarian law is unambiguous. Civilians must be respected, civilians must be protected, and the needs of the population need to be met. With no fuel having entered Gaza in more than 17 weeks, the Secretary General is gravely concerned that the last lifelines for survival are being cut off. Without an urgent influx of fuel, incubators will shut down. Ambulances will be unable to reach the injured and the sick, and water will not be able to be purified. The delivery by the United Nations and our partners of what little of our life-saving humanitarian aid is left in Gaza will grind to a halt. The Secretary General once again calls for full, safe, and sustained humanitarian access so aid can reach people who have been deprived of the basics of survival for way too long. The UN has a clear and proven plan rooted in the humanitarian principles to get vital assistance to civilians, to do that safely and at scale wherever those people are. The Secretary General reiterates that all parties must uphold their obligations under international law. He renews his call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire and for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. That statement is now being shared with you. And just to give you a bit more detail of what is actually going on the ground, I can tell you that the space left for civilians to stay is shrinking by the day. Just yesterday, Israeli authorities issued yet another displacement order, this time for parts of Gaza City, citing Palestinian rockets fire. Our colleagues estimate that about 40,000 people were in these areas, which included one displacement site, one medical point, and a neighborhood that has been spared from any displacement order since before the ceasefire. As of earlier today, about 900 families are estimated to have fled. OCHA notes that since mid-March, when the ceasefire ended, over 50 such orders have been issued. Together, they now cover about 78% of the Gaza Strip. And the Israeli militarized zones, and that if you add the Israeli militarized zone, and that percentage jumps to 85%, leaving just 15% where civilians can actually stay. Those areas are, of course, overcrowded. They also severely lack any services or basic services and proper infrastructure. One can just imagine having just over 2 million people stuck in Manhattan, which is actually slightly bigger than Gaza, but instead of buildings, the area is strewn with the rubble of demolished and burnt out structures without any infrastructure or basic support. And in Gaza, these remaining areas are also fragmented and unsafe. Yesterday, our colleagues from the UN Population Fund said that menstruation has become a nightmare for an estimated 700,000 women and girls in Gaza. They remind us that alongside food, people need water, soap, menstrual pads, and privacy. UNFPA notes that it has supplies ready, almost 170 truckloads worth, but they are not being led into the Gaza Strip. In a report issued yesterday, OCHA notes that since last Thursday, 9 more aid workers have been killed from 5 different organizations. That brings together the total number of aid workers killed to 107 so far this year, and 479 since October 2023. Among them, 326 of our UN colleagues. Looking back at the month of June, out of nearly 400 coordination attempts, 44% were outright denied by Israeli authorities. Another 10% were initially accepted, but then faced impediments. Only a third were fully facilitated, and the rest, which is about 12%, had to be canceled by the organizers for logistical, operational security reasons. Today, we've had 4 denials out of 16 coordination attempts, hindering our team's effort to relocate medical supplies and remove debris, among other critical operations. Moving north to Lebanon this week, the newly appointed head of our UNIFIL peacekeeping mission and force commander, Major General Deodato Abanyara, met with Lebanese leaders, including the President, Joseph Aoun, the Speaker of the Parliament, Nabi Berri, the Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense and the commanders of the Lebanese armed forces. General Abanyara underscored in his meeting the mission's support to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, including the strengthened deployment of the Lebanese armed forces in the southern part of their country. On the ground, UNIFIL peacekeepers reported Israel Defense Forces' military presence and its activities north of the Blue Line, including air violations and mortar fires impacting several locations in Sector East this week. Meanwhile, peacekeepers have also continued to discover unauthorized weapons caches, including one containing mortars in Sector East. This week, also, UNIFIL supported the important work of humanitarian agencies by facilitating missions from OCHA, UNICEF, UNDP, the UN Refugee Agency, and the World Food Program in the UNIFIL area of operations. In support of the capacity building of the Lebanese armed forces, the UNIFIL Maritime Task Force this week carried out training exercises for the Lebanese Navy and the Lebanese Air Force. And a note on Cyprus, in addition to what we said yesterday, in preparation for the informal talks on Cyprus in the broader format that will be held in New York on July 16th and 17th, the personal envoy of the Secretary General in Cyprus, Mariangela Holgan, is traveling to the island this week for meetings with the two sides. Earlier this week, she met with senior representatives of the United Kingdom in London, as well as the European Union in Brussels. She will visit Paris on Friday for meetings with French officials. Turning to Ukraine, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reports that airstrikes in the past 3 days have killed and injured civilians. According to authorities, at least 10 civilians were killed and nearly 60 injured, including children. The strikes also damaged homes, hospitals, schools, and agricultural supplies in frontline regions. According to local authorities and aid workers, the Donetsk region alone, authorities reported damage to over 80 homes, schools, and other civilian facilities across the region. Health facilities have not been spared. On July 1st, shelling damaged a hospital in Kherson, injuring at least 3 health workers and 5 patients. Today, drone strikes in the same city damaged several ambulances, civilian vehicles, and windows of another hospital building. Between January and June of this year, WHO recorded 255 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine, accounting for nearly 40% of all such attacks verified globally. In 2025, these attacks caused at least 6 deaths, 55 injuries among medical personnel and patients. That's what the World Health Organization is telling us. Humanitarians continue to respond, providing construction materials, emergency shelter kits, blankets, hygiene items, and mental health and psychosocial support. And Alex, I think you had a question a number of times on the Memorandum of Understanding, and I can tell you that the final consultations meetings on the Memorandum of Understanding between the United Nations and the Russian Federation will take place on 11th July in Geneva. It will be led by Rebecca Greenspan, as it always is. She is, of course, you know, the Secretary General of the UN Trade and of UNCTAD, excuse me. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed on the 22nd of July 2022 with an implementation period of 3 years as part of the efforts, as part of the Istanbul Agreement and the efforts of the Secretary General on global food security and in the context of the war in Ukraine. In parallel, the Secretary General has also continued to advocate for continued exports from Ukraine and the Russian Federation, including through the proposal on safe navigation in the Black Sea, which continues to inform discussions, and we will share that with you in writing. Also want to read into the record an announcement that went out yesterday evening about the newly appointed Special Representative of the Secretary General for Haiti, and that new Special Representative is Carlos Ruiz Massieu of Mexico. He will be the SRSG and head of the UN Integrated Office in Haiti. He succeeds Maria Isabel Salvador of Ecuador, to whom the Secretary General is grateful for her dedication and service. Mr. Massieu, as you know, is currently the head of the UN verification mission in Colombia since 2019, and he has over 30 years of experience in public service and diplomacy, both in bilateral and multilateral context. An important note, though, Mr. Ruiz Massieu will assume his new functions as SRSG for Haiti in August. He will be here in 2 weeks' time to brief the Security Council on Colombia. Also on Yemen, some good news coming out of Yemen. Our UN team on the ground is telling us that the 2 local water authorities in the Taiz Governorate, the local water and sanitation corporations in Taiz and the Al Hauban, reached a technical agreement jointly to manage the water supply systems, restoring essential services that have been disrupted for nearly a decade due to conflict and institutional fragmentation.